Good morning, class. This is Mrs. Politsky, and here are your notes for Chapter 30, Section 2, Independent Struggles in Southeast Asia. Before we get going, I just want to kind of lay some things out here. We're going to be talking a little bit about an era of time known as the Cold War. And this was a period of time that started right after World War II in 1945 and lasted until about the beginning of the 1990s. So, before we begin, we're going to be kind of looking at this map down below here. And before World War II in number 1, which parts of Southeast Asia were controlled by Great Britain? And that would be Burma on the map, or now known as Myanmar, and Malay, which is today known as Malaysia. These areas and some of the others, like Indochina, were controlled by the French. And if you go further down into Indonesia, this was controlled by the Dutch, and over here to the Philippines, this was controlled by the United States. So, leading to that, what was the main causes of the Vietnam War? Well, this war really has its roots kind of going back to the World War II. Many of the Vietnamese were loyal to the French, and as a result of fighting off the Japanese, many Vietnamese thought that maybe they might earn their independence from France. And that didn't necessarily happen. And so there were a group of men known as the Viet Minh who fought the French, and by 1954 they had defeated them. So Vietnam was divided after that defeat, and as a result, in the north you had the formation of North Vietnam, which was a communist nation. And in the south, you had the formation of South Vietnam, which was a nation that was kind of pro-West. I wouldn't call them a democracy, but they had leanings towards France and the United States. So, letter D, or B. The U.S. fears spread of communism. As a result of the end of World War II, there happened to be a spread of communism through parts of Asia. In 1949, China had fallen to the communists, and since the northern part of Vietnam shares a border with China, there was great fear that communism would spread here as well. The Viet Cong, aka the VC or Charlie, joined the North Vietnamese to defeat South Vietnamese fighters. The Viet Cong were not exactly an army, but they were fighting alongside the communists, and they were, for the most part, pretty much citizens. They looked like civilians. They did not have uniforms necessarily, and that made the fighting in this war very complicated. Number 3, the belief that if Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeastern Asian countries would quickly follow was called the domino theory. And this is something that was kind of coined back in the 1950s during the height of the Cold War. We had kind of seen this already in Eastern Europe. After the Germans were defeated in World War II, the Soviet Union had gobbled up quite a bit of territory in Eastern Europe, and those nations were basically communist puppet states of the Soviet Union. And the same thing was kind of happening towards Europe, or towards Asia. Number 4, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was a resolution that served to escalate the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. This was an event that took place in 1964 when a U.S. ship was supposedly under attack by a very small, what I would call a patrol ship or a gunship that came kind of out of the waters of North Vietnam. And as a result, the United States started doing air attacks and eventually bringing in combat troops. And as a result of that, we also implemented a draft during this period of time. Number 5, the United States supported the South Vietnamese to keep them from being taken over by the North and therefore becoming communist. And as you can see in the map here, we have quite a few different battle sites. Down here in the south, We had several different events that took place. One thing that we should know is, like, in 1968, there was an event called Tet. Tet is the equivalent of Chinese New Year. And during this time, there were an unprecedented numerous attacks on military bases and cities in the South by the Viet Cong. This red line down here, this is something known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, named after this man over here named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the kind of the leader of the Vietnamese communists. And this was the supply route to get weapons and anything that the Viet Cong would need to fight the U.S. presence in South Vietnam. Over here, this is kind of a striking photograph. I don't know if you can see the man that is here in the middle of the picture. This happens to be a Buddhist monk who happened to not necessarily be all that interested in the foreign presence in Vietnam. Not necessarily happy about the French, but also not happy about the United States. And as a sign of protest, he doused himself with fluid, lighter fluid most likely, and set himself on fire. It's a very extreme way of showing your distaste for what's going on. All right, our next item. Number 6, U.S. involvement in the South caused the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to change your strategy. Instead of pressing for a quick victory, they focused on outlasting their enemies. And they did a very good job of that. Number 7, in 1968, there was an offensive known as the Tet Offensive, which I just mentioned, that occurred on the Vietnamese New Year, called Tet. And as a result, all sorts of bad things were going on. Back here at home, support for the war kind of waned as a result of that. Number 8, the Viet Cong benefited most from the Tet Offensive because it showed that they were capable of an effective attacks against the American forces. They also benefited from the secondary effect of the weakened public support. Some of that was because back home, the media basically started saying that the war was unwinnable. Today, Vietnam is a communist nation. The United Vietnam is formally recognized by the United States. Matter of fact, it is one of our biggest trading partners. All right, before I leave you, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of these photographs. Up at the top here is a fellow named Pol Pot. The people that Pol Pot led were a group of individuals known as the Khmer Rouge. Rouge, French for red. And as kind of a secondary result of the Vietnam War and the fact that during the war, the United States was bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is in parts of Cambodia. Pol Pot and his followers came to power, and they were ruthless. His time in power was sometimes known as the killing field for all the people who were killed during his time as the leader of that nation. All right, thank you very much.